Well, to our final speaker this evening, the man for whom this foundation is named, John Cain. One could say that his success in becoming this state's 41st Premier in 1982 went back over a decade to the 60s and 70s when he first supported Gough Whitlam in his push to change the status quo in the Victorian ALP. Please welcome John Cain.
Well, thank you very much, Maxine, and you've had a great treat tonight with those insights, and my task is to try and distill that content and explain how it was that Whitlam's contribution to Australian politics was so profound, and it was, and what lessons we've learnt from that contribution and what they mean to us today. It's a contribution that you have to go back in political history to understand, because it's through the politics of the late 40s and early 50s and 60s that the Whitlam way of doing things is honed in a very precise way. MHR in 1952 for Werriwa. He's comes into the federal parliament when the party's already in turmoil. Menzies elected in 49, and it's an ugly scene, Australian politics. Cold War's alive and well, sectarianism even more alive and proceeding at a great pace, and a nasty sectarianism it became, as I'll relate later. So by 55, the party split, certainly in Victorian Queensland and generally across the country, and shortly after that the DLP is formed, that becomes a significant force in Australian politics. And the ALP is in electoral trouble of some considerable proportions. Now, Gough lives through all that as a backbench member. His star, to me, emerged in 1958 when he was a member of the All-Party Constitutional Committee in Canberra, and his pronouncements on the Australian Constitution were of considerable comment around the country, and he marked himself very clearly to others and to me then as somebody who was concerned about the big issues. So that's the first lesson that we learn, I think, from Gough's involvement. It's said about, a lot of historians have said, and commentators, that all Labor leaders have to take on the party. I've heard that said by many. Gough took it on more frequently and with more relish than any of his predecessors and any of his successors. He was none before and none since have been so vigorous in that involvement. He was concerned about the party structure, about the platform, and about the policies. And by 1964, he had a fairly strong set of language that he used about the federal executive. He talked about the 12 witless men. His expulsion was threatened on more than one occasion, and he almost lost the parliamentary party leadership with a challenge that he threw out without knowing what the numbers were, and survived 3 or 4 days later by a narrow margin. So understand this, by 1965, Whitlam has been in Parliament for 13, 14 years. He's been in opposition for 13 or 14 years, and he's been in a party split in the way it was for 10 years. He sees the electoral fortunes of the party having no future in the 60s at that time. So the nationwide response was one of almost indifference. Now, at that time, and this is about which I want to say something tonight, Victoria was probably worse than the rest of the country. Most of you here tonight will remember why it was. That Victoria was in a worse state so far as sectarianism was concerned. We had Mannix, the Archbishop, we had Santa Maria, and the Santa Maria papers are in the State Library now, just out in this building. they're well worth a good look. Santa Maria kept everything he ever wrote, anything anybody else ever wrote. Mannix required everything that he ever wrote or received was destroyed 2 days before his death. But the whole structure of the Labor Party in Victoria was around sectarianism from the late 40s. I had my first party ticket given to me by my father as a teenager in 1948. We knew the branches in the Northcote electorate, which were Catholic branches, which were non-Catholic. He had to fight a pre-selection in the late 40s after being Premier on 2 occasions, opposed in a pre-selection by a Catholic Action candidate. So the only reason I mention all that was it was very, very bitter. And it reached the stage where households divided over it, as you have heard. Branch stacking was an art form. It was the branches were stacked largely from the parish roll. It was pretty easy. Later they were stacked from ethnic resources, but it was from the parish roll. So there were open conflict in all those branches until, of course, the formalities of the split occurred in 1955. It was so bad that the first majority Labor government in Victoria, elected in 1952, was in fact voted out of office by people who broke away from the Labor Party and voted against it in the Parliament of Victoria. So that kind of action did bring out the worst in many people, and some would say the best in others. But those who survived and remained part of the formal Labor Party in Victoria were just as authoritarian, were just as overbearing as their predecessors had been. That was the problem, that the split threw up a bunch of bigots of another kind. It was said that there were branches of the Masonic Lodge in various parts of the Trades Hall. So, though I hear some almost incredulous responses, that was how bad it was. And we need to understand that, I think, to appreciate just how significant was the actions that Gough Whitlam took to resolve, as he did, that he had to do something about this. You see, from 1955, there were 33 men, they were all men, Iola and Maxine. They ran the Victorian Labor Party. They were concerned about administration, about pre-selections, about disputes, everything that went. Run the conference. There were no women. They ran the whole place. And only 2 years ago, it's interesting to note, Gough Whitlam said that neither he nor Ben Chifley would he believe have won a pre-selection in the ALP today, such as it was. I find that an interesting comment. But Gough was concerned about the lack of any democratic processes within the party. Now, about this time, it's the early 60s, there were a few dissidents in Victoria, of whom I was one. Michael Duffy's here today, he was another. They're a disparate bunch. Barry was concerned about it, and Howard Nathan. There's a whole gathering of people, and we knew we'd tried. We were unsuccessful in doing anything of any consequence in Victoria at the conference. We'd run tickets and lost. There was also a very small number of Victorian trade unions that were concerned as well. There was not one member of the Victorian or federal parliaments, Labor members, that were concerned to do anything about it. They chose not to because their pre-selections were clearly at stake. So look, Gough Whitlam came to Victoria. He came and spoke at Victorian conferences, spoke in forthright fashion, as Race has outlined, about the impunity, about those who were powerless and how they were powerless. And he came, as John said, to our home to talk to people about it at the dissident group. He wasn't as concerned about them as he... It was a brave thing to go to that conference because his deputy leader, his later leader, it was a brave thing for a parliamentary Labor leader to do, to take on what was in effect the establishment of a state branch that was paramount in Victoria at that time. Lesson learnt, Gough Whitlam showed us then that to do the things he wanted to do, the things that you've heard here tonight that he did do, and about which he was expressed strong views, you had to have political power. You had to win power in the party. And that's what he accepted. If you want to do and implement the things that are Labor values and Labor vision, you've got to have a parliamentary majority to do it. So in those years, he established his authority and his integrity by the issues that he looked at. He's concerned about the national party, not a state-based party, internal party democracy, about constitutional reform, electoral fairness, about national health, legal aid, all those things that Race and Barry talked about. Gender equality, as Iola so eloquently expressed. And that's the other lesson we learn. Big views about big issues. There's a book published recently on Franklin Delano Roosevelt by a man called Jonathan Alter called The Defining Moment, FDR's 100 Days and the Triumph of Hope. And I quote, he says, Franklin Roosevelt was a rare mix. He somehow combined instinct with calculation, exasperating improvisations with what some of his contemporaries called long-headedness. Long-headedness. A way of peering forward, fixing a point far away on the horizon, then tacking toward it without much worry about the day-to-day choppiness en route. That's Whitlam. It's a very, very telling quote. That's what it's all about. You can, after a period of office, after a period of doing things, you can look back and say, what did we achieve? You know, unfortunately, the last 5 or 6 years before 2013, Labor didn't achieve a lot. But you can look back in the Hawke government and the Whitlam government, and I believe our government of Victoria, over the time we were there, what did we effect by way of change? What were the lasting things that mattered? They're not all legislation. They're about attitudes and about values and about the way you approach those things. So Whitlam brings that long-headedness, and by 1969, he and everybody else knows that you can't win government in the National Parliament, and he's been in opposition like the rest of them for then 20 years in 1969, 49 to 69. He knows you can't do it. When you have a state like Victoria that sends 33 members to the House of Representatives, producing no more than 9 or 10 Labor members. That was the key. Victoria was not pulling its weight. Victoria had 33 seats, 10 held by Labor. So he took on the Victorian branch over a whole host of issues. I won't go into them now. But we were able to help him to have a case that was legally watertight. And he brought in 2 or 3 federal members, Clyde Cameron notably, I suppose, to get the numbers at the federal executive. And that's when it all happened. Intervention in Victoria brought to the party in Victoria a degree of, and later New South Wales, a degree of internal democracy. It brought to the party a lust for power and a desire to have policies that reflected Labor values in the long term. And from those early 70s, when the intervention in Victoria occurred, Labor has become a strength to the national cause, not a weakness. It's become a strength even today, and there's been some backsliding, as we all know. Even today, we are able, in the 2010 federal poll, Labor polled better in Australia than any other state. For Victoria's part, pardon me, before 1982, we'd only been in office for 8 years, and only 2.5 of those were majority government. That's all. Now, since 82, by 2018, with this last win, we will have been in office for 24 years of the last 36 in Victoria. It is a remarkable... It is a remarkable turnabout. Look, in summary, the lessons are many. They have been hard learnt in some quarters. You see, Gough Whitlam took the view that even though it was some 15 or 16 years on that he became involved, Victorian Labor is moribund, it's never too late. You never give up hope. You always keep at it. The party intervention from outside Victoria. He recognised it was the only way to achieve it. For the next 25 years, as I said, those have been the golden years of Labor. I think to some extent the policy work that we did post the dismissal in 75 through to 81 or 2 before we came to government here in Victoria was coloured very largely, and it was prodigious work by Labor people, not just party members but a wide range of Labor people. It was coloured by the anger of the dismissal, coloured by the long-headedness of Whitlam and the recognition that you had to do the big things in policy. You had to do the things that were policy decisions, recognising that to implement them properly you needed a good bureaucracy and a group of people working in private offices as well, working in coordination with them. So it's a significant lesson that we learnt, and we're still learning it, I think. You see, as I said, there has been some backsliding. I spoke about Gough Whitlam's endorsement back in 1952. He was one of 9 candidates, and there were 3 ballots, and on the first ballot he got 17%, and he came up through the field. He was not the favourite. The point I make is that, as Gough said a couple of years ago, that neither he nor Chifley would have got an endorsement now. That's probably right, because they didn't, as Gough says, they didn't have a champion behind them or a factional warlord requiring people to vote for them. There's nobody, as the writer of the piece I read recently about the Whitlam pre-selection in 52, there's nobody looking over their shoulder as far as you could tell. There may well have been, knowing New South Wales. But the last point I want to make is this. Don't believe that there are not people who will not still pursue the worst features of the Labor Party in the 50s, 60s, and even later than that. There are some who will today seek to justify the fact, and Race alluded to this indirectly, I think, the fact that for the last 3 general elections in Victoria, the candidates endorsed by the party for the upper house, so that's the elections of 2014, 2010, 2006, were chosen by the party factional heavies. Did you know that? 3 elections. So don't run away with the idea that there are not those who will seek to justify that. Last point is this. The lesson Gough Whitlam gave us all in a lasting way was you never stop. Even long after he was retired from the federal parliament, he visited his office regularly. He was available for people to talk with, and he never gave up. He always believed that there was something more to be done, and that's right, there is. All of us who are no longer involved actively in politics still have a job to do, whether you've been a public office holder or whether you've been a strong adherent and believer, a true believer over the long years that many of you and I have passed through. There's always something else to do. Never forget that. Gough Whitlam didn't.